The Pacers went into Madison Square Garden and beat the Knicks 130 to 109. Trevon, what are your thoughts on game seven in Madison Square Garden and the Pacers going in there and beating the Knicks to move on to the Eastern Conference Finals and play Boston?
Well, I think that this was just a dominant game from the start to finish. The Indiana Pacers came out with a whole lot of energy. I think their confidence was up coming out of game six, where they had a pretty dominant performance there. And up until this point, every home team has won each of the games. None of the road teams have been able to break through until today, obviously, with the Pacers closing out the series. But I think that they just had a level of confidence and a level of energy where they were able to come into a hostile environment. Madison Square Garden, probably the biggest stage in NBA basketball that we have. And I think it showed on their play on the court. You saw everybody contributing. It wasn't just one guy running the show. And I think that's kind of how they played all season, a fast tempo pace, everybody getting out on the break and running, and their defense has really stepped up in this whole playoffs. And I think that moving forward, when we look at teams, we're going to have to really consider and kind of not measure them too much by their regular season defense, because the Pacers this year have proven to us. And then we look at the Nuggets from last year, where they weren't seen as a great defensive team, and they went on a great run in the postseason and were able to fare up well in that matchup. And when teams are elite offenses like those two teams are, and they're able to compete and be respectable defensively, I think that's when they really shine and really take over in the postseason. And that's just what we saw from the Pacers. We saw Tyrese Halliburton probably have his best game of this series, where there were a lot of games where he didn't look like his normal self. We know how down the stretch of the season, he wasn't the exact same that he was up before the All-Star break. And you see guys like TJ McConnell all series long contributing, Aaron Naismith hitting big shots, Andrew Nimhart coming in big, and we had Miles Turner really showing up, doing what he does well. I think this was just a complete total team effort from the Indiana Pacers. And we know in game sevens, anything can happen. So all the home court stuff goes out the window. Anything that happened before no longer matters. And we just saw the Indiana Pacers seize the moment. Kind of reminded me of the in-season tournament this year, where they took down the Milwaukee Bucks, and ultimately they ran into the Lakers, but they showed you then that they could be a very formidable team when things are clicking on all cylinders. And I think they just stumped on the Knicks next and never took their foot off the gas all game. So a real dominant performance. And I think they just executed. Everybody was playing. I think it was clear that they had way more energy than the New York Knicks. The Knicks were kind of banged up at this point. And I just think there was a big glaring difference between the consistent effort the Pacers were able to get and the kind of lackadaisical, kind of beat down energy, worn down energy that the Knicks got. And I think it showed all game. That's why they dominated from start to finish.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of it was a full team effort. Their defense was really what stood out to me all series and all playoffs long. I think players like TJ McConnell, Naismith, and Nimhart, those were the engines of the defense, right? Those were the guys that really played that point of attack defender position. They got after Damian Lillard in the first round. They got after Chris Middleton in the first round, and that set the tone. And now, when you come to a New York Knicks team where Jalen Brunson is hot in the playoffs, he's dropping 40 points in multiple games, right, consecutively. And you put a player like Naismith on him to give him a challenge in terms of athleticism and length, right? That can
Mm-hmm.
stay in front of him and contest a lot of his shots. You put a TJ McConnell on him to put pressure on him full court and stay with him as he goes off of those off ball screens and get through those on ball screens and just be the ultimate pest that he is. And then you have Nimhart, who is guarding him as hard as he can. Early in the series, Jalen Brunson was taking advantage of that matchup, but over the course of time, and you just keep throwing different bodies at him, Nimhart played a really good defensive game on Jalen Brunson, especially this game in game seven. So I think those guys were great in their roles. And then they just started hitting shots in game seven, like all three of them. they were just going crazy and knocking down mid-range shot, 3-point shots. It was just clicking for the Pacers. And when Halliburton is aggressive, this Pacers team just takes on a different attitude and they have a different identity, right? Because he's being able to push the pace, take shots, and get his game going. And then after that, there's an overreaction by the defense, and he's able to take advantage of that because he's such a great passer. You have Miles Turner being that rim protector and getting rebounds and things like that as a big, but also being able to shoot from the 3-point line. And so that created advantages and mismatches for the Pacers. And then you have Siakam. I think he was the best impact player for this Pacers team going from when they traded for him all the way to now in the postseason, because especially in this series, he was able to take advantage of those mismatches when he has a smaller guy guarding him. And once the Knicks found out, yeah, we can't really guard him one-on-one. We have to send another body at him. We have to double team him. And he was just able to take advantage of that, kick the ball out. And once you have two guys trying to corral Halliburton, and then once it gets into the post for Siakam, and now you have to go double him, it just creates advantages for the Pacers offense. And we know all season long, they've just did a great job taking advantage of their opportunities. And at the end of the day, the Pacers just won the war of attrition. I mean, the Knicks ran out of gas. It was a valiant effort by them, but just too many injuries, man. And honestly, they might have had the worst luck injury wise for a playoff run that I've ever seen. I think 5 or 6 players of their main players have sustained some sort of injury throughout this playoff run or throughout this whole season, actually. So, shout out to the Pacers. You got to tip your hat to them. They did a great job, and also shout out to the Knicks for just grinding out as long as they did. But the Pacers are the ones that came out victorious, and they are moving on to the conference finals.
Yeah, I think you pretty much said it. Like, we just know that the Knicks were not able to bring that kind of energy that they typically bring, especially at home. It kind of looked like the games on the road where the Pacers were just hitting from all cylinders all game, and the Knicks kind of just couldn't get to the point where they could just kind of switch the whole momentum of the game. And it's crazy, man. Like, the Pacers shot 76% in the first half. Like, that's outrageous numbers. I think they only missed like
Crazy,
five
man.
shots like
Crazy.
around that first half. And
That's 2K numbers.
yeah, it really is. And like, I attribute that to, not every bucket that the Pacers had was like a jump shot or a pull up or a three or anything like that. A lot of them were just getting out fast, like after a made basket. Like, that's very rare that you see people get out on a made basket, but we know how quickly the Pacers like to run. And, there was one to Siakam where he was able to get an easy layup. Nimhard walked into a three where Anunoby closed out late. And you just saw them capitalizing on those opportunities early, getting those early buckets. And I think that's what started that confidence. And you never know what you're going to get in a high intense, high stakes game like that. You may get players to play out of their mind, and you might have players where they just kind of come up a little bit smaller, not quite what they usually are for your team. And I think the Pacers just have that continuity. You spoke about it with Tyrese Halliburton. We know how good a leader he is. I think TJ McConnell is another guy like that where you just see how hard he plays. And I think it just naturally rubs off on other players, and Aaron Naismith, him as well. And I just think everybody had that confidence and that level of where, there's already a lot of animosity built up through the whole series. And they just really took it to him. And you had Tyrese Halliburton chirping at the crowd, being the kind of second coming of Reggie Miller in this whole series or whole Pacers, the Knicks series saga that has been going on throughout basketball history. But yeah, man, I think like you saw guys like Josh Hart really go out there where it was questionable if he would play. OG Anunoby came out and tried to play. He came out early. He didn't really seem like he can move well. And after he got taken
Yeah.
out the first time, you never saw him again. Um, it's just tough for them because this was probably the year where you were like, man, they can really make it to the conference finals with the way things were shaking up. The injuries just built up on them and they couldn't really be quite what they were all year. Brunson, he struggled, getting picked up full court from like a TJ McConnell and then an Aaron Naismith and then an Andrew Nemhart, all guys that are going to compete defensively. Like that wears on you. And by the time he crosses by half court, the shot clock is dwindled down. You don't have too much time to really get into your sets and your actions. And they just couldn't really find that rhythm offensively. And they were honestly in good enough position going into halftime, even though the Pacers were shooting 76%, which is crazy. Like we said, they were only down by 15. And
Yep.
you know, with that Knicks crowd behind their back, like anytime they made a slight run, the Knicks crowd was there roaring loud, cheering them on. And you thought that it could give them that burst of energy, but they just couldn't break through every time they had a chance. Then one of the guys on the Pacers would come through and hit a big shot. They got like a turnover off of an
Yeah.
inbound. Like they just did multiple things to kind of quiet that crowd and keep
Yep.
the energy low. Even with DiVincenzo having 39 points today, he was going crazy. It kind of reminded me of game number three,
Three.
where
Yep.
he went crazy and they just couldn't really get over the hump. And I think it was the same thing then where Jalen Brunson wasn't himself. And then same thing this game. And then he fractures his hand. That pretty much just nailed it in the coffin there. So this was a great series. We saw a lot of effort from both teams. We saw that kind of like chirping back and forth with each other. And I think the Pacers just came out and executed well. And they did all the little things that we usually see from the Knicks, like the hustle and, every possession. And due to injury and fatigue, I just don't think the Knicks were able to do that. We saw the Pacers really dive in and hone in that energy and that focus. And they couldn't have been touched tonight. And they just showed it from the start to finish. That was a dominant game.
Yeah, and honestly, what you said, that was the difference in the game tonight, especially. And I think ultimately that was the difference in this whole entire series. The Pacers won the war of attrition, and over time, I think that's what showed because for me, the difference was, especially for game 7, you have Jalen Brunson, who is the main creator for the New York Knicks offense, right? And he struggled. And I think that it was just a culmination of fatigue and the injuries he's been dealing with, but also that Pacers defense because they just took advantage of all of those things that I talked about with the Knicks. But on the Pacers end, they had multiple guys that they could throw at Jalen. They had multiple guys that were contributing on the offensive end and on the defensive end. So again, the Pacers, they just won the war of attrition, and I think you got to give credit to them. But when you mentioned the Pacers getting the ball out off of made baskets, I think that was so big because the Knicks are already banged up. They're already gassed. And you just getting the ball out after they hit a basket. And there were multiple times where there was no Knick player back on defense, and the Pacers were just getting wide open layups or easy baskets just because they were doing that. They were just getting the ball out after a made basket really fast and getting the ball up the court. And I think when you have a Pacers team that does that, and that's what they've been doing all year, to go up against a Knick team that was just banged up and gassed, I think that was just a perfect storm for the Pacers.
Yeah. And I think like the big key about that is the 76%, right? None of those were really shots that they had to really work too hard for, shots they
Exactly.
had to really struggle for, shots that were that much contested. Like a lot of those shots were at the basket. A lot of those kind of helped them spark that offense. And then we also spoke about the transition, beating the Knicks set defense and stuff like that. So I think that's just another tribute to, or another way to point out the fatigue of the Knicks defense because they're usually going to be in your face. You're usually going to feel their presence. It's not going to be that easy for you to get shots off. And it just kind of felt like all night long, the Knicks were just a step too late for the Pacers. And I just think they kind of sensed the blood in the water and they took advantage of it. Like those guys were on one tonight.
Yeah, and I think the best game in this specific series to encapsulate what we're talking about with all the players playing the way they did and Siakam. and the dynamic he brings to this team. I think it was game 3 because that's when the Pacers figured out, oh, we can take advantage of this matchup with Siakam, and there's just nothing the Knicks can do about it because they're banged up and they're playing with a smaller lineup now because they have guys out, right? And once that happened, the Knicks started sending a double team, and then they just started playing out of it, and that's really what opened everything up for the Pacers. And Tyrese Halliburton was able to get going and be aggressive. And then, if you really think about it, I think that's the game that was really the pivot point for this series because if you guys remember, the Knicks had a chance to win that game, especially late, but they missed some layups, made some turnovers, and the Pacers just took advantage and won the game. Nimhart hit that 3-pointer, that big 3-pointer. So, if the Knicks win that game, I think this series just, we all look at it differently and it turns out differently. But again, the Pacers did what they had to do. Shout out to them. And I think this was a big step for them going on to the conference finals.